Just an hour and 3 minutes ago, I had my afternoon nap, sat down on my computer, and there was this SMS, "You're on today, Tom." I thought it was next week. So this could be very short and boring. So I'm more than happy if you walk out at any stage. I don't mind. So yeah, this project, so the question, I mean, historically, Queensland or Australia has always been sort of seen, the history is very secular, you know, that, and we're always contrasted more in a global sense with the US. You know, we didn't have the Pilgrim Fathers, we had convicts. So we were a highly secular nation, and there's a number of reasons why this sort of, I guess, misconception has continued. Partly because how do you talk about the impact of faith or religion? Because it's intangible, it's often difficult to articulate that very clearly. I mean, if you want to talk about the impact of the pastoral industry, you can look at, and because I'm a heritage person, I'm always interested about place and fabric and stuff. You can say, well, look, there's all these pastoral properties in Queensland. You say, well, yeah, that was important. Or if you want to talk about the history of rail, you look at railway stations and railway lines everywhere, and it's easy. But, so the question is, maybe with religion and churches, why don't you look at churches and when they were built and where? And you think, and no one's ever done that. And there's some reasons why. And is it possible? But, so this project actually started many, many years ago when I was doing heritage work throughout Queensland. I thought, as a sideline, I'd photograph churches in places, wherever. And I thought, probably just to make a record, you know, because no one often photographs churches and next, they're gone. So I started this sort of on and off project. And then I built a website and I thought, well, I might try and make a little database online. So I had this online database with, I bought this plugin and it all worked really fine, and I had a few photos, and then typically with technology, you know, the programs didn't work anymore because, you know, it upgrades. So that collapsed, and I thought, oh, well, I'll go back to first principles and I'll actually build the whole database myself. Right, okay. One thing led to another, and I got more serious about it and started looking at all the data that was there. And it's interesting, some denominations have been very good in recording and documenting their history and keeping records. Like the Methodist Church, for example, found in their library, they've got a property register that sort of told you from day one to the 1920s, all the properties that they owned around Queensland, not only when they were built, how much they cost, how much debt they were in year by year, the size of the place, etc., etc. So that's all pretty good. The problem is that some denominations were very good at keeping records, but others weren't. For example, the more decentralised denominations like the Brethren, nothing, you can't. And so that presented some problems. And of course, again, smaller denominations like the Christadelphians, for example, nothing. However, in the last 15 years, with the access of online newspapers and a whole lot of other online sources, what has been possible, and this project grew from just recording existing churches to say, well, look, you get a bit ambitious to say, well, look, why don't you do every place of worship that was built in Queensland, and whether they're demolished or they've been sold and become a house or whatever. So it got more ambitious, and there was a number of things I wanted to do. A, the name, the location, the denomination, its status, and very importantly, a GPS location, because I'll show you in a minute why that has become incredibly important. So this got more and more ambitious as it went along, and fortunately there have been other people that have kind of been working, doing related things. Like a good friend of mine, he was also photographing churches, and he's photographed 2,500 churches around Queensland, would you believe? He's a forester, so he photographs forestries and trees and churches and whatever. So it's been a crowdsourcing exercise. So what this has meant that now I'm up to 4,500 entries. And that's, and I should say the other thing is that I'm not excluding any denomination. So some people say, Jehovah's Witness, no, they're not Christian, we won't do them. Certainly Jewish places, temple, mosques I've got, Sikh temples I've got, Chinese josh houses, more than you think were in Queensland. So, as I said, now I'm up to something like 4,500. So I'll just show you very quickly some stats. And this first is something that by looking at this, well, this is buildings by denomination. And the first thing is, if I can just zoom this in a bit, or out a bit. What is interesting about which denominations were builders and which weren't so much so. So this is a list, and actually, if I go to this other document, oh no, sorry, I'll go here just for a minute. So the top of the list actually is Catholics, as you can imagine. They're about 25-30% of the population.
Tom, what's the time frame on this?
This is from 1848 to today.
Is 1848 a significant time?
Well, it was the first time a church was there. People will argue with it, but the first building that was actually built that was a church. I mean, a little bit before that, like Brisbane was settled in 1842, but they were just using kind of rented properties. That's the other thing I should say. I've excluded places that, like schools or halls where people. I'm talking about dedicated places of worship, if that makes sense, by and large. So, and this is, yeah, so look, I'll come back to this list in a minute, and there's some interesting figures here that, yes, for example, over this time, Baptists who were proportionally in the population much smaller than Presbyterians, they're only 2 or 3%, but they actually build almost, over time, as many churches as the Presbyterians. The Presbyterian, and the other obvious standout are the Methodists, who are about 10% of the population, but they build probably something like 16-20% of the churches. And again, all these statistics raise some interesting questions about what was going on. And of course, the Methodists, particularly in the 19th century, well, no, up actually until the 1970s, were ardent builders, and they would build, unlike the Presbyterians that would wait till we have a congregation that's enough. The Methodists were very vigorous in building little churches all throughout Queensland, everywhere. Yes? Stay here.
In the vicinity of the camera. And the
Sure. Yeah. The other interesting statistic of the Lutherans, who are even smaller still, but still built something like over 200 churches. And that raises this interesting question about Lutherans that my feeling is from this, and all of this needs more work and research, is that by and large, the Germans who came in the 19th century to Australia came with a suitcase that was Lutheran. So, unlike, say, English people that came, there were plenty of Anglicans that were totally nominal. By and large, it seemed the Germans were sort of committed, semi-committed to Lutherans. Now, that had its own problems for the Lutherans, because the interesting thing is that you find with the that there was schisms, and also there was just generally this desire in the Lutheran Church to keep their ethnicity by having services in German. Not all Germans that came like that. So what they did, they left. And very much the Church of Christ was formed out of disgruntled Lutherans. They also left to become Methodists. In fact, at Hagues-Lee, they were so... they said, we're leaving the Lutheran Church, we're going to become Methodists. And they also took the church with them. They actually moved the Lutheran church somewhere else to become Methodist. So, yeah, yeah. And I mean, there was another one. They left. I'm not going to be Lutheran anymore. I'm going to become Lutheran Congregational. Figure that one. So this is just, I guess, the spread. But I'll just go to this other sort of chart. And so this shows by decades the number of churches. And what's very clear, I'll see if I can just zoom this out a little bit more. No, the other way, sorry, zoom in. That's it, sorry, I know. But what you can see here...
Shift control minus, that will take it down.
Oh, okay, yes, sorry. So, yeah, good, okay. So, quite a lot of construction in the 19th century. Now, what's interesting in England by 1900... Oh, sorry? Oh, yes. Sorry, David. you know I can't keep still. By 1900 in England, there was one church for every 1,000 people. In Queensland, by 1900, on these figures, there's about one church for every... Now, I mean, if you had to guess, would we have had more or less churches per capita in Queensland by 1900 than England? Remember, they'd been building churches there for 1,000 years. And you think, no way. But in fact, we had one church for every 600 people. So, I just put over this. I say, okay, in that decade, we had 300 churches built. Quite extraordinary, really, for how small. I mean, and so there's a lot of building going. Now, there's a couple of reasons. Again, this was just, particularly the Methodists, the primitive Methodists were very prolific. I mean, the Catholics were prolific. Anglicans, everyone were building churches everywhere throughout Queensland. And so it belies this myth, I think, that, Queensland was this incredibly secular place. The other thing is that these churches often followed very closely on settlement. Gympie, for example, which was gold was discovered there in 1867. In 6 months, there was a primitive Methodist chapel there. It wasn't as if these churches came 10 or 20 years later, but very quickly on with early settlement. So you look throughout these decades, but I think that, and this is where I just want to sort of spend a little bit of time, the decades of 1950 and 1960. So between them, in those 2 decades, 900 churches were constructed in Queensland. And that's kind of, like a fifth of the whole period. So it's quite extraordinary. And again, that raises some interesting questions. Why? But because I guess we might have heard of, been familiar with, the Billy Graham Crusades, but that was a period of crusades in all churches, and not just Protestant churches. I think if you've grown up a Protestant, you think, oh, we were the only ones that had missions and evangelists. But it was mirrored in the Catholic Church as well. Catholics, there were orders that was essentially sort of evangelists that went around to parishes, and they had massive rallies in Brisbane in the 1950s. Archbishop Dewey, and he was an ardent builder of churches, but they filled the exhibition ground with their sort of. There was the year of the Rosary, I think it was, in 1955, and it was monumental. So, again, I mean, the biases we have probably as non-Catholics, we think, Oh, they didn't have, didn't have a Billy Graham, but in fact, evangelism and commitment and above all piety was incredibly important to Catholics. So that's kind of, really, as you can see, the high point. But what is interesting as well about this, so we see from the 1960s to the 70s kind of quite a sharp decline, and we can say all of this is part of, the decline of religion and church attendance. But I think what is interesting, and this is where I want to ask questions rather than give the answers, that when we go back to the 1980s, there's still 300 churches being built in Queensland. In the 1990s, 290, which is quite a remarkable number. Now, what I haven't got is a breakdown in those years. Let me ask you, see if you can guess, what denomination in those 2 decades might you guess built more churches than any other? No? Sorry? No? They were up there well, but Baptists, no. They were active, very active. Pardon? No. It blew me away too. It was the Jehovah's Witness. And this is what I say about looking at this from the ground up. Like, someone would think, oh, well, we'll look at these denominational histories, and we'll get all this information and data and they do these church surveys. But someone like the Jehovah's Witness, they truly do keep to themselves. It's very difficult. To get any information about... I can't get any information from a website or anything about when one was built. The way I've got it, when these buildings were built, is from aerial photography. And I might say that that's been one of the really incredible things, that now aerial photography of Queensland is all online. So I can date buildings often very accurately by, this is an aerial photograph in 1986, and the building's not there, and in 1988 it's there, so it's got to be. But yes, the Jehovah's Witness. So, and then I guess the other interesting thing about this period is the plethora of again small groups, new. Not just the AOG, which now the Australian ACC it's called, but all these other little groups, kind of, what would you call them? Clusters, and there might only be the 3 or 4 that belong to this cluster, but they're out there alone, like the Brisbane Christian Fellowship that meet at Samford. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, tend, very much keep to themselves. They've got a branch in Gympie and on the Sunshine Coast, but that's all. SPX, let me get it right. SSPX, does that ring any bells to anyone? I was looking at this church at Oxley, and it said Catholic. So, it's fine, I looked up, I thought, this is interesting, and I looked up the Archdiocese website, and where's this church at Oxley? It's not part of the diocese. What's going on? It belongs actually to a group called the SSPX, which is the Society of St. Pius X, which are a breakaway from the Catholic Church after Vatican II. They're ultra-conservative. They've got 7 churches in Queensland. And it just goes on. There's all these odd little, small little, very independent, often, but not always charismatic groups. And this is where questions that, I'll just throw a couple of things out and then we can start discussing this. The other thing that strikes me about particularly the churches since what's happened in the 1980s is and this is about how faith, religion, it reinforces ethnicity. in a whole lot of ways. I mean, there's quite large buildings that belong independently, like Full Gospel Church at 8 Mile Plains. I can't read its website, it's Mandarin. Next door to that building is the Chinese Methodist Church. So I just really get constantly amazed. I mean, out at 8 Mile Plain, no, further out, actually in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there's also a Russian Pentecostal church. Yeah, I mean, you kind of name it. And this doesn't go then. I think in Queensland we have every variation of Orthodox that you can imagine. I mean, there's only one or two of them often, but they're all quite small, but around. Not just sort of Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, but
Free Serbian Orthodox.
Serbian Orthodox, exactly.
And Free Serbian Orthodox.
Pardon? Oh, yes, and the free, yes. Yeah. So, can you tell me about the differences and where they are? Yes.
Oh, I can't tell you about the differences, but Vulture Street West End is the Free Serbian.
Yes.
And then there's the Maronite just down the road about a block away.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then up again, there's another Serbian church.
The Serbian one at Wollongabba.
At Wollongabba, there's two, and they've actually united again. But what fascinates... Yeah, they have.
Miracles still happen.
They do. And what is really interesting about the church in Wollongabba, in Vulture Street, the sort of on the foundation stone, this is in memory of the conflict that happened actually in the 13th century. But let me... I'll just show you a church and talk about sort of the variety. I'll just show you this one church. The other thing is, partly about doing this, is that having kind of toured a lot of the state, you get familiar, and you do absolutely see things that are not documented anywhere. And to me, this is the classic one. Now, what is it? Control Shift?
Control Shift minus.
Minus. Oh, okay, yeah.
Maybe that's the easiest.
Control minus. Okay, yep, okay, good. All right, why don't you just work on a screen at home? Okay, Targini, does anyone know where Targini is? It's a little community outside Gladstone, farming community. Now, again, all these things that you come at these from side angles. About 15 years ago, I did this project for Department of State Development because they were buying all this farm for industrial expansion. And so they wanted me to write a history. So I go up there and I discovered actually there's some Russians that live there, or white Russians, and so I go and I get to go and see this man called Jacob, who's 99. He couldn't speak Russian, but his son Serb could. That was English, I should say. And I said, "Oh, we've got a church here." I said, "Could I go?" He said, "Oh, yeah, you can go. Not that he ever went." He said, "But it starts at 7, but don't go at 7. Go at 9. That's fine. And just remember, they stand up for the 3-hour service." So I went, and this is the building. Now, it doesn't have a sign out the front. There's not a shred of written evidence anywhere about this building, and it's mistaken for a little chapel, and it could be anything. But this was the chapel of the Old Believers, and the Old Believers was came out of Peter the Great's sort of reforms, classic in the Orthodox Church, and these were the traditionalists, like they didn't like his reforms, and they by and large were persecuted over they've been persecuted over 300 years, and many of them sort of under Stalin escaped into China and were around Harbin, and then under Mao, that's when they came and settled in Australia. So I actually went to a service there, and of course you kind of stand out because I don't have a beard. But the most remarkable thing about the experience was that the lay priest invited me back to his house for lunch or brunch, and it still absolutely blows my mind. You're in this little building, and it's all in old Russian, the liturgy. You know, it's not new, you know, it's 1,000-year-old Russian. And you look out the window, and it's just the classic pastoral scene of Queensland, you know, with cattle, and you think... But this guy, I got invited to lunch, and there he's got a satellite dish where he watches Russian news. You know, just amazing. But, sorry, this is kind of a sidetrack, but just shows the variety in Queensland. Might be one or two places. But, so getting back to just my observations about what's happened in the 1980s and 1990s. We quite rightly mentioned ASC, and there's a clear trend, and I mean so much is written or it's talked about sort of the Pentecostal church and its rise, etc., etc. But I think in a way it's a misnomer, because the model of that, in a sense, and I'm talking crudely, and pull me up if I'm wrong, and this is what I like to talk about actually, is that by and large when you look, and you look at websites today of all these churches, they're so similar, and their statement of belief is so similar. I mean, the website, I mean, someone I think just, you know, it's just pretty standard template. The whole model is very similar. A big building, the bigger the better. The other hallmark is a big car park. Big car park. And it's worship as theatre. And so if you take a photograph inside of these interiors, it doesn't matter if it's a Pentecostal church or a Baptist church, or some Uniting churches are like that, some Anglican churches are like that. Even the one that got me was that Genesis College, out at Brendale, I'd been past this place many times, big school, and I thought I just made this terribly incorrect assumption, well, that's another kind of charismatic church. It's not. It comes out of the Reformed church tradition. And their model, again, you know, of how their worship structure is similar. So I think that to me is really interesting about what's happened in the last, you know, 20, 30 years. And so I think it's this misnomer to talk about the Pentecostal movement, because I think so much has moved on. It seems, well, that's my assumption. I could be absolutely wrong about this, and I'd be interested in your feedback. The other interesting thing is a friend of mine, he's a good Baptist. His name is Sweetman, so if you know the Baptist church, you know, there's lots of Sweetmans around. But he made the interesting comment that in the Baptist church, that because they had, you know, there are these large Baptist churches, Bridgeman Downs and River Life, you know, that are big. And he said, in his views, he said probably there are 6 or 7 of them, and out of all the Baptists in Queensland, probably 60% go to those 6 or 7 places. Anyhow, look, I'll leave it there, because I think I'd just like to sort of discuss, well, we can discuss anything, but I'm really interested. Oh, yes, sorry. Oh, well, I was going to move aside so you can talk, but sorry. Sorry, there's one other aspect. So getting back to this ethnicity question. I've constantly found these churches that have sprung up. That there's another example is a Catholic church at Hillcrest on the southern side, And I've always got to look up and look. Actually, I'll see if I can find it because the name's an absolute classic. I always forget what it's called. Okay, yes, this is it. It's Orthodox Syrian. Okay, it's St Thomas Jacobite Syrian Orthodox Church. An interesting history. It's people that have come from southern India that are Syrian Orthodox from southern India, would you believe? And on their website, they give a little history that look, most of us, we started coming to Australia in the early, Queensland, Brisbane, in the early 2000s, mainly health professionals. So they're wealthy enough. And I think the other interesting thing is that 40 years ago, when people like this came from different ethnic groups, someone might have been at Brackenridge and someone at Mount Gravatt. And because of transport and communication, if you were Catholic, you went to the Brackenridge Catholic Church. But they come to Australia because of the internet. They can communicate with each other, and then, we're rich enough we can buy this Lutheran church and we can become St Thomas Jacobite Syrian Orthodox. So that's another, the other light all of this shows, it really shines this light on how multicultural Queensland is, that we just don't often realise. As I say, all these churches, this part of it just goes on and on and on. Like this church, just Chinese Malays or Singaporeans. It goes on and on and on and on. And of course, the other big group are Koreans. They're not, again, and it's hidden. This is the thing, it's always hidden. There are not many church buildings that are Korean. There's a Korean Presbyterian out at Runcorn, but a friend of mine goes to the Indooroopilly Uniting Church and says, the congregation Korean comes after the white fellas, and there's 400 of them. But anyhow, let's talk about more, but I could have gone on for too long, right?
So, look, I reckon, are there any questions just about church buildings before we have a conversation about what it means that people would like to ask? Or are you happy now to break into small groups and just have a conversation about what Tom's already said? So,
possibly mine's a bit more of an analysis question. If you do a graph with year on the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis you have a graph of number of people attending church in Queensland,
yes,
divided by the number of churches in Queensland.
Yes.
Does that graph go up, down, or stay the same?
Oh, well, for part, it's an issue about attendance, the stats on that. Yeah. The only, and this is the problem, the only stat we have is really from the census, which is,
there's that other survey of, just forget the organisation.
Yeah, but they're more recent. No,
Yeah.
I guess my argument is, because we haven't got that, the fact that someone built a church, at Laidley or Blenheim in 1902, they were Baptists, and it cost them £300, it says something about,
Yeah.
isn't it? That's the point, that I never want to read too much into it, but it does say something I suppose this is the other critical thing in Queensland. These are all built, almost without exception, by voluntary subscriptions. It's not government funding like in other countries that the government sort of built these churches. And of course, the other interesting thing about this is that they're often built by voluntary labour as well. Baptists were pretty good at doing that, and Methodists. And the other interesting thing is you could build them very quickly. There's a number of churches that were actually built in a day. Yes, it's not. Yeah, there's a. Go on. Yes, I guess I'll show you a photo in a minute.
I'm just showing us that photo.
Sorry, can I just ask just a clarification, that more recent style of church, was it church as theatre? Was that the term you used?
Look, church as theatre. I'm scratching around still for a very good kind of definition of what I'm about. I mean, does that make kind of sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't got a better term, but that's
That's what it is.
that's where it is. You know, like it's.
Well, that's what we all say, at least from our generation, but when you talk to the people who go, they don't see it that way, at least the ones I've talked to. So I think I sound a little word of warning about
Oh, look,
just the terminology we might use about others who...
look. I exactly right. You know, I'm sort of scratching for, and that's yeah.
It is something.
I guess what I'm saying is, physically, when there's something physical about those buildings that are similar across denominations, and it's different. You know, it's different. Where you know it's
Auditorium with huge stage, large music.
The stage and sound system.
it's
Yeah.
changes.
And a big PA usually is the big loud band.
Yeah. I
A
mean,
good band.
and
Very good band.
it's very inward. You know, and the other important thing is lighting.
Yeah.
So there's no interest, you know, traditionally of windows and looking outward. That's all. So those attributes, however you want to describe, and it's not probably the best term to use, but so just as a matter of interest, this is a church in Warwick, right? East Warwick. It was built in a day. 30 people, 40 people.
It's
Not
like
hard.
the barn raising.
It's a bit like that, yeah, that's right. And I don't know. And interesting enough, it's still there as a house. But the point, even not building it in a day, I mean, many places you could build a simple church, timber church, over a weekend. 4 people could do one in a month. I've thought about it myself. If I had to do it, you know, I was a bit.
So Tom, just another question then. You've touched a bit on purpose, but so in some places the church hall became a very much focus for the community.
Yes.
And a place where weddings happened, all
Yes.
sorts of things happened. There's obviously been trends in that sort of space as well. Like if you looked at the functionality of churches as well as where they're built and who built them and so forth.
Absolutely, and that's actually another, because drilling down, and it's interesting, what purpose, you know, I mean, you could say they had this kind of religious function, but always, and when I look at, you know, as I say, they were just everywhere in Queensland, these places, and I'll bring up a little map in a minute, but yeah, it was very clearly, this sort of sense of community and identity. That's what drove them, and I mean, you know, if you start reading the history of even these little churches, you know, the groups that were associated with them, whether it was ladies' groups or men's groups or whatever, very strong sense of identity, and you could argue that's another interesting question about, you know, if you wanted to look at churches today in Queensland. I mean, vast majority of churches in Queensland are small, that still have that sense of purpose and community, and they survive because of that reason. So there's no question that they were really important glue.
In some rural areas, it's almost they built a church and each denomination would have a different Sunday to run.
They did, yes, that's... Look, how long you got? You've got another few hours. Well, look, again, they call them generally union churches, and there's quite a lot of them. Yep. You know, and they changed around from week to week, but that was, you know, we'll build one, and everyone can use it, which is kind of interesting. It flies in the face of the traditional views of you know, denominational sort of segmentation, and even the interesting thing you find is particularly at church openings, all the ministers came, and even to Catholic churches. I mean, there's this wonderful, I think it was in Innisfail, Archbishop Dewey goes up, you know, and everyone's there, all the Protestant clergy are there. So it flies in the face of the traditional view that what happened on the ground was very different.